So this week, Lord Norton and the Statutory Inquiry Committee has reported that they would like to shake things up in terms of how the recommendations of public inquiries, statutory public inquiries, are implemented. Dan, you've worked on the undercover policing inquiry, you've worked on the Chilcot inquiry, you and I recently have worked on the Grenfell Tower Inquiry and the COVID inquiry. So you've got a wealth of experience in that area. Broadly speaking, what's your view on the sort of success rate of recommendations of public inquiries, not specifically those ones, but public inquiries in general, recommendations being implemented?
Well, I think there is a perception that very often they can fall by the wayside, and that's the final act of the public inquiry, and then there isn't that connection between those recommendations being made and an assurance that they'll be implemented. There are some that have been very successful. I mean, we've made reference in the past to the Macpherson inquiry and the comprehensive adoption of the recommendations of that inquiry. But at the moment, there is no means or mechanism of ensuring that when an inquiry does make recommendations, that they are then in fact adopted by the government.
For what reason do you think that they might not be implemented?
I mean, there'll be a multitude of reasons why perhaps governments change, and they'll almost inevitably have changed since the inquiry was launched. So the financial circumstances of the country and etc. moves on, but there is at present no legal mechanism. Although interestingly, the Grenfell Tower report, which is very recently published, in fact makes a recommendation that beyond the recommendations it makes about fire safety, and
it makes a recommendation about recommendations.
It actually makes a recommendation about the implementation of recommendations, which goes a lot further than the initial scope of the inquiry. And it's an important one because it essentially says there should be a legal mechanism for ensuring that the government maintain a publicly accessible record of all of the recommendations and whether they've been accepted, and that record should include reasons for not having accepted them, and recommends that Parliament is then able to hold government to account to explain why those recommendations that have in fact been accepted are not then implemented, because that process at the moment is not really enforced or set out. So
sure, it's not as transparent as it could be.
No,
that seems sensible. And do you think that if that suggestion were to be implemented, do you think that sort of potential widespread lack of faith in the inquiry process, do you think it would go some way to resolving some of that?
Yes, I think it probably would. The wider public understandably want to see tangible results from a public inquiry. They often run a long time. They run a long time because there's a huge amount of evidence to examine, and they tend, in my experience, to really get to the heart of what the issues are and have well-evidenced, well-reasoned, well-researched findings. That takes some time. Recommendations follow, I suspect, and understandably, the public would like to see the results of that. And the results of those of a public inquiry would be those recommendations being implemented, visible change being made as a consequence of the examination of the evidence that the inquiry is undertaken.
And it seems as though there would be fewer people better placed to make suggestions for that, widespread change than the people who have sat on that inquiry panel for however many years.
Absolutely, they've really got to grips with the issues, haven't they? As we've seen, particularly with Grenfell, they've got to grips with the issues. They got to grips with how those issues would have come about, and they've got to grips with what needs to be changed and the detail of how those changes can be implemented. And the recommendations set out in Grenfell Tower report, for example, are thorough and very well reasoned. And so understandably, the public would want to see those implemented. And if they're not, a very good explanation being given for them not being implemented.
Yeah, I think that's the key, isn't it? It's that sort of intentional setting aside rather than just, a government that has just potentially just not acted.
Yeah. And if it's just fallen by the wayside, that's not acceptable, is it, to anybody? There may be a good reason for a recommendation not being implemented, but that is the purpose of that. That's what this Grenfell recommendation says. I mean, that's the purpose of Parliament to scrutinise that and hold government to account when a recommendation is there for them to, and they have accepted it. If it's not implemented, why not?
Okay, thank you.